All right. So this is the I think I'm going to trip over the very first words of the podcast. This is the Embodied Dialogue podcast. And I'm Seth Dellinger, and I am amazed and honored that both Guy Sengstock and Daniel Garner are here. Maybe when we jump into it, you guys can add any additional self-introductions, but I'm just going to say a little bit of how I know the both of you. So I met Guy, I don't remember exactly at what point, but let's just say during the pandemic. And Guy is the discoverer of the practice of circling and founder of the Circling Institute. And I trained with Guy online for a couple of years, and it's all about really what I hope we're going to get into more deeply in our conversation today, but really the art of connection through conversation. And coming from a background of working with embodiments, and I'm just using that in a kind of I think when most people hear the word embodiment, they're thinking of, stuff you do with your bodies so your body feels better. And I practiced the Feldenkrais method, and this tended to be, I'm lying on the floor, I'm doing different movements, I'm thinking about the length of my spine and my breathing and all of that, and I can get up and feel better. But I had this whole history of not feeling so comfortable socially, and what I discovered was, I can do my Feldenkrais and feel great, but then I talk to other people and I kind of don't feel great anymore. And so that was kind of what drew me into circling. And the first time I spoke with Guy, and he led what is known as a circle, where he put his attention on me with some other people, I was kind of amazed that we had this conversation where it was kind of like getting to know you, but at the end of the conversation, I felt different in my body. It was an embodied change that happened through the dialogue. So anyway, circling really kind of connected some dots for me in that way. Guy has his own YouTube channel, and I'll let him say more. But I also want to speak briefly to meeting Daniel more recently online, and I was lucky enough to visit you and meet you and your family in person recently. But I originally found out about Daniel because he was talking to Guy on Guy's podcast. And just in terms of where we're going today, I would say that what I've learned from you, Daniel, that's been so important is really connecting my body to the world, in the sense of this is a really complex world that we live in these days. And you just released a book called The Map is Indestructible. The Map is Indestructible?
Yeah.
Right? But how do we map this dang world that we live in? And how do we deal with the fact that things seem to be falling apart in all these different ways? I originally met Guy partly through the work of John Vervaeke, who talks about the meaning crisis. And Daniel, you along with your wife, Michelle Garner, the two of you write under the name O.G. Rose. You also have the book Belonging Again, which really talks about the fact that there's just so little common ground that we have in today's world. I'm sort of been shorthanding it with people I talked to recently by saying, well, if we met each other 100 years ago, around here, I might say, may God be with you. And it would just make sense to say something like that. But if I were to say that to a random person on the street right now, I don't know what kind of reaction I would get, right? Because there's just, so everyone's dealing with a different kind of a map of how the world works. And, Daniel and Michelle, the O.G. Rose, have written about this quite a lot recently. And then this call here came together as a kind of this is intended as a kind of a part two of a conversation that Daniel and I recorded, which actually started on your porch when I was visiting. But the initial question was kind of like, why is it so hard for us to talk to each other these days? And there's some simple answers. We can say political polarization. We can talk about, as I've already gestured to, the meaning crisis, the fact that, your neighbor might have a totally different background. But then, okay, if all that's true, what do we do? And what are some of the skills that we need? And how can we, move through it? And so if anyone's just catching this conversation, I definitely recommend they check out the first conversation with Daniel. But as we talked about it, one of the things that came up a number of times, since we both know Guy, was practices like circling. And then it was just like, well, let's bring Guy in and let's see where else we can go. And just last thing I'll mention so that listeners know is that there's a contemporary thinker, I guess he calls himself a social philosopher by the name of Hartmut Rosa, which Guy introduced Daniel and I to just recently, but I guess you've been, delving into his stuff. But I just wanted to maybe invite Guy to begin, and any responses you had after watching that first podcast or listening to that first podcast. Anything else you're thinking about, Hartmut Rosa? And at this point, we'll just see what happens. But welcome to you both, and thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. Do you want me to start?
Please, yeah.
Go to start. Okay, cool. Let me know when I've started. Wait a minute, did I already start? Or
you're almost there. You're getting really close.
Close. I can feel it.
It's nice. The thing. Actually, there was something in listening to the podcast that you guys did earlier. That stood out that I wanted to ask you about, Seth, was, and you just mentioned it, but it caught my attention. I just wanted to kind of inquire a little bit more about it. Was you talked about having a recent visit with Daniel and his house and being around his family and I think you mentioned something about being around his neighbors or the community around there or something like that. And you said you were pretty impacted by the sense of hospitality, I think is what you said, or something like that. I just wanted to hear more about that. Like, what was the thing that struck you about?
Well, the thing that really struck me is how when I pulled up to the house, Daniel's son Haley came out ahead of everyone. He was like extending his hand for the handshake from about 30 yards out. Okay. And then he comes up and says, "My name is Haley and I'm pleased to meet you." And then Daniel comes out of the house with Michelle, who's got baby Paul, on her belly, and Grace and Reed are like running in, 4 different directions and circling the whole thing. And as they come closer, Daniel goes, "Seth is here, Seth is here, Seth is here." And then when he gets close, I can't remember if you gave me a hug first or after, but he says, "Seth is here, it's time to do a dance." And he pulls a harmonica out of his pocket, starts playing a tune, and the entire Garner family starts dancing. And I'm like, I guess I'm supposed to dance too. And so,
yes.
So that was the impact, like from that's how I landed. And then, you can listen to Daniel talk on a podcast, and if you don't hang out in these spaces, you could sort of say, well, that's a lot of complicated words. But I never had a moment with you, Daniel, where I didn't feel like you could talk to anyone who crossed your path, which was just beautiful to me. Because I think that, when we try to get into a lot of complexity of the human experience, one of the things that we end up doing is developing what can sometimes feel like esoteric vocabularies for people, right? Like I mentioned before, John Vervaeke. When I first listened to John Vervaeke, I don't really know what he was talking about, but there was a kind of an energy there that welcomed me in. And, if you spend time with people who write long books like John Vervaeke or Daniel Garner or others, you do sometimes have to do your homework to sort of like get in there. But what I was impacted by was just that sense of welcome in the Garner household. And, the kids like treated me like Uncle Seth, like from about essentially right when I arrived and everything. So I could say more, but that's what I was impacted by.
What? I'm just curious, like if you were to guess that, well, it sounds like you're impacted by the relationality, right?
Totally.
In fact, he met you before you got there, right? He extended out, and the thing you said about the dancing and the reciprocity, the extended reciprocity. What the hell? Why is that there? What do you make of that? Like, what's going on with Daniel in his family? Is it something in is it something fermented in the food that's making him really, really crazy? Is like
Well,
what is that?
yeah, yeah. I was curious if part of the magic was the fact that another thing that happened while I'm there is we see a figure in the distance walking, and Daniel says, "Oh, that's my dad." His dad came over, and later said, "Well, there's my dad's place." And then down the road is Daniel's brother. So this family is actually, unlike most American families, still a connected family, more than one generation. Um,
Yeah.
I've heard that being in Washington, D.C., I'm technically in the South, but I felt more like I was in the South when I was in Lynchburg, Virginia. And just, it's a cliche. I can't claim that just know this, but I had that feeling of, the Southern gentleman and just the overall, the Southern hospitality, the sense of, maybe if we get to know each other, we will discover disagreements, but we're not looking for our disagreements yet. We're starting with getting to know each other. And, here comes another person down the road. What I want to do is greet them and make them feel at home and maybe comment on what kind of a day it is, not because it's small talk, but because we're actually both experiencing the same day. Like, the person could say to you, it's a beautiful day, and it could feel like a throwaway, or someone could say it's a beautiful day, and you feel like they're sharing with you their experience, and that's so. What's in the water, I don't know, but it just feels like my assumption is this is kind of how it's always been. That what I'm finding peculiar, you might not find that peculiar, Daniel. You just say that, well, this is just how I was raised, and this is just how it is, but. That was how it landed for me.
So I'm gonna ask your intuition something, right? Just kind of imagine this. Just imagine that, okay, same house, same Daniel, same kids, but dad and brother and family live way somewhere else. They're not there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's your intuition say about in what way, if it would have changed that picture at all or that experience?
Without the family? I mean, I could understand the question in different ways, but what comes up when you ask it, even though it's not exactly the answer to the same question you're asking, is I didn't feel so much differentiation between people who were members of the Garner family or weren't. I just felt like everyone was treated like family. Was kind of the experience.
Well, I'm more asking about let's just imagine that he didn't live close to his family.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was just him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not his family, right?
Mm-hmm.
They weren't integrated in their lives or anything like that.
Sure.
Do you have a sense of, would you still walk up and would it be just as exuberant? Would it be just as welcoming? Would it have been what's your sense about that?
Well, it's usually pretty welcoming and exuberant when I just connect on Zoom with Daniel. So I think it would be. I think it would be. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. You're not circling me, are you?
No. I'm curious about this because I think you mentioning that has a lot to do with what we're talking about, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm.
That turning towards the other, right? Mm-hmm. And the way, how we turn, who that other is, right? Is so much of how that unfolds, right? That initial making contact with another human being and what that is and what that means. And I think my question was I would imagine, I would imagine they would still be them, right? But I could imagine actually the amount of safety and assumed rapport and welcoming and openness and because I mean most people would be kind of reserved and nervous and not as trusting. but it sounds like that family was, Daniel's family was like, none of that. They were just eager, right?
Totally.
To welcome you in, which presupposes a lot of something isn't on the line. Something's not at stake in that meeting with you, right? Like there's something going on there that like is not at stake in the matter. Therefore, they don't have to worry about it, right? And I think this is one of the key things that I think a lot about this way in which it's like there's like it seems like an inherent existential tension in being human, right? At one level, in order to like really discover the world, right? To really open up and learn, right? I have to risk, right? I need to open up. I need to challenge myself. I need to be challenged. I need to confront and be in the presence of and reach beyond what I know, right? And at the same time, like if I'm not secure, right, my ability to do that or even desire to do that goes down and down and down, right? So there's this way in where there's this one level of where it's like with his family, I would imagine just, you guys growing up together in the same neighborhood. It's like you guys are just part of each other's lives. It's there's a certain relationality, right, that you guys dwell in that is just there, right? It's there in this way such that they don't have to think about it, right? And they can just open up to the world because there's like in Bowlby's language, it's like there's secure attachment, right? The degree in which I can securely attach is to the degree that I can open up to ambiguity because there's a place to come back to, right? In a certain sense. And so I think when we're talking about relationships seem to have like a conversation can have both of those functions. Like on one level, like a conversation can lead to, right? Or tear apart, right? A sense of gathering and security, right? And at the same time, a conversation can reach out into and open up and realize things that neither one of us could have known about, right? It's open up. It can open beyond what we could intend, what we could want, right? There's this level of where relationships seem to like they have these two like extremes that they can go to, and you need like they're in an interesting way existentially. It's like it seems like there's a tension that in relationship that realizes an existential tension that it is to be human, right? This relationship between belonging, right, and autonomy, right? This risk and security, right? These two things I think are in a tonos, and I think that there's something about relationship that determines how that is for us and reenacts that over and over and over again. And the other thing I'd say is I'm waiting to see if I'm in the Epstein files. So
They don't exist. Don't worry about it. It's not apparently.
right. I hope they don't redact too many names because I want to know. Like, am I there? I thought I was the janitor. Okay.
We'll have to talk about the role of humor. Well, let me just also mention, and I don't know if either of you had the time, but another thing that was passed around in our email exchange before this was a conversation between Bonita Roy and Ezekiel de Paolo. And I don't know how he would officially talk about his official designation, but he comes in the lineage of the 4E cognitive science, Francisco Varela. And when you were speaking just now, Guy, one of the things that he talks about is how if we're in conversation, each one of us is having an experience, which is, you were characterizing the ways that it opens us up, or we also have that desire to maybe shut down if we're not sure. But he would talk about how the conversation itself is an organism. And the sort of classic example he would give is like if we're on the phone and then we get to the end of the phone call, but we kind of notice it's hard to end the phone call because we keep just mentioning one last thing and starting a new topic and it keep and so he talks about in terms of embodiment that he says we have four bodies at the same time. We have an organic body, which we can describe what cells do and, following a sugar gradient and this kind of a thing. Then we have a sensory motor body, it helps me navigate my body around the room or, and doesn't necessarily know what's going on at the atomic level and all of that, the molecular level. But then we have our intersubjective bodies where we have to coordinate with each other. And this is not yet, he's not yet talking about language, but this could be like, for example, we try to pass each other in a narrow hallway, but we keep moving aside to the same side and we do that little dance. That's like the dance of some intersubjective bodies. But then at the level of language, he talks about linguistic bodies and how where literally our embodiment is formed by language. Like you could think of part of the way that your body came to be the body it is today is through the history of all the conversations you ever had. All the times you got surprised or embarrassed or, you fell in love or you changed your worldview and all of those things that happen in different conversations. So I just kind of wanted to mention that and bring it in. And then I'll also just gesture one more thing. Daniel, I didn't have time to hear it all, but you were just talking to Tim Adlin yesterday. Very much, I think, on similar vein where we're going now. But so I just wanted to mention that, but I want to throw it over to you, response to what Guy said, and just what's coming up for you now.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with both of you at the same time because both of you are fantastic. So this is great. And it was wonderful to have you at the farm. And that talk in Tim Adlin is awesome. So I appreciate you listening to that. I think you're getting at some very important things, Guy, on this idea of this balance between belonging and risk. I like to think about belonging and meaning, and there's something where you have to have both. If you have belonging without meaning, you feel dead. You have roots, but nothing grows. But if you have meaning without belonging, then you're unsecure, and actually that meaning can lose alienation because you're really interested in philosophy. You find it meaningful, but no one around you does. And therefore, it actually contributes to isolation. So there's some sort of need for both. And if you get one without the other, it's as if you don't even get the other, actually. And there's something about security that's very, very important. If I were to speak of my own experience, I always grew up with a concept, something that we talk about that is stewarding. The notion that you are stewarding something, that you are responsible for a space and that you want to make sure that the space is maintained so that the conditions of possibility for growth or emergence or something can occur. One of the things I do think you get when you have sort of your family and, my grandparents lived here, et cetera, so forth, is you have a sense of continuation. And I know you were speaking with Desmond, and there's this notion, I think for me, I may have a sense of sacred time more naturally that other people do not, because you have a sense of a sort of compounding and continuation beyond you that you are part of, that may contribute also to a porous self, as Desmond was saying. And I was very glad William Desmond is a very important thinker. And I think it also helps with almost a feeling of betweenness, because you're between the grandfather and the father, you're between the children, and there's sense of the self is destabilized as a kind of solid identity, and it's participating in something continual. And my experience is you're responsible, like when I think about myself, in where we live and what we do with the, et cetera, there's a certain responsibility of continuing something. Most people in Western society are actually operating ex nihilo. They have to graduate from college and build from the ground up, right? And I think it's not by chance that people end up in a bad nihilism, which of course there's a contradiction in that, as Desmond was saying. But most people have a kind of nihilism because you start with nothing and you have to build up to something, right? Well, right there, I think that's setting people up for atomization, because what are the chances what you build or what the other person are building? And you also get a sense of you're not actually supposed to build something that other people participate in because you're supposed to make your own way and be free and have your own status, right? And that notion of autonomy is the guidance of the good. So actually, you're not really supposed to steward something, you're supposed to make something of yourself, right? So I think a major advantage, a privilege advantage that I have is and it just makes me think of Hartman Rosa. I guess I've always had a different experience of time. I do not experience time as this thing I need to accelerate in order to make the most of myself to prove I've made something ex nihilo. You have a sense that time is going to go on without you. It's not in a hurry. Time is not in a hurry. Seasons are not in a hurry. I think also Michelle speaks a lot about the sociology of space. I think when you live on a farm, you see time as nature. When you live in a city, you see time as a clock, as ticking away, right? Now, of course, clock time eclipses with farm time, but there is much more of a sense that time is manifest in space. Not the measure of space, but it is manifest in space. And your job is to steward that space and let time unfold. And there is something for me where meaning plus belonging equals stewardship. And that stewardship creates a porous self that also has a certain familiarity with a sacred time. And that also leads to a certain resonance that I think is very, very important. And in that stewarding, too, here's the other key. You're stewarding something that is not for you. You're stewarding something for what enters it and what comes out of it that cannot be predicted ahead of time. When you make a garden, you have a sense of what it's going to grow, but it's also going to surprise you. The unpredictability of the world, which also Mr. Rosa was stressing. Like this idea that when you steward something, there is something in that is an attempt to be hospitable to the unexpected. Like hospitality, there's something very important for me, and like hospitality, if we take that phrase, hospitality, in order to really be itself in the way that maybe Derrida stressed it in a positive way, really can't predict it. It can't be planned. It can't be a system, right? Hospitality has to be a certain sort of meeting whatever is there. And being ready for it and not showing that you are shocked by it or surprised by it, right? And this, I think, gets into circling and embodiment in the nervous system. If when you encounter difference or you encounter a person or someone difference enters the space and you go, oh, you're here, and you show it because you don't have control over the nervous system, you've thrown off the energy, right? There's an energy that has been thrown off. But then how do you actually get to the place where your body is, say, even in terms of the nervous system, not having that reaction that throws off, dare I say, the vibe or the resonance? Well, this definitely can be helped if you have your family and there's a certain security that comes from being in your immediacy, people that you know have your back. That is definitely an advantage that can help with the nervous system. But if we have a society that says, oh, if you're around your family, you failed to make something of your life and you don't have any status and you're just living on a farm, wow, what a failure. Then you're going to have people going off to make the most of their life according to status incentives in a manner where they're making ex nihilo and are in a condition where their nervous system can never develop because they're always going into basically environments that are too foreign too quickly. And when you're also overwhelmed with work and overstressed, you don't even have the time to try to face that extreme challenge of plurality, of that level of difference, right? Because basically, this would be a large thing, and I'll stop because there's a lot to say, but it's all very important. The greater the difference, the more time you need in order to focus on those relationships so that you can actually meet them in a manner that doesn't existentially overwhelm you, right? Well, we tend to get the exact opposite. Because places where you get more difference tends to be in more urban areas or suburbia, which is precisely where you have less time because you have more work demand. So it's the worst of all combinations that you could possibly have. Whereas I think the challenge today is to actually create spaces of enough security where people can, because there's a ditch on either side of the road. The danger of more of dare I say, agriculture structure is a belonging that never goes out. You get a belonging that never goes into diversity or that stays isolated and secluded. And and this is actually where resonance can be a problem. Precisely because resonance is great, you might be like, I'm not going out there. And then you actually end up isolated, and you could even end up in fascism if you're not careful. But if we are going to actually figure out how to have resonance in and between global pluralism, which is our challenge, that is the challenge of our age. Not simply resonance, although I'm not saying resonance is not necessary. It's resonance in global pluralism. That is the major unique challenge of our moment. It's way easier to get resonance with people that are more like you because they also bring with them the security that simultaneous provides the basis for that resonance. We've got to figure out how to do that on terms where there are not givens. But there is absolutely something, just to close the point, when you have a setting with family and you also have a space where you experience time and you feel like you're stewarding something, I think those things do come together to make one more porous in as Desmond made, or more in a way where you're looking to the other. And that I think also affords one connection with sacred time, with that sort of sense of a different unfolding of time. And the question simply becomes, what are the ways by which we can think about that? Well, for more spread it, I suppose. But those are just some opening thoughts.
Can you say something more about, so basically like, you're talking about time, right? That there's different ways of relating to time, and there's different, maybe even temporalities, right? And there's something about time and this experience of cultivation, right? Of stewarding, right? And then he talked about like clock time and city time, right? Where it's like more of a sense of like there's that like overdrive of like self-justification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I am a means of production, right? And therefore I'm only as good as the thing I'm producing at some level, and that's the thing that's always not totally there. Therefore I need to get somewhere faster and right, and then he died. Can you say a little bit more about what is it that makes time, I think you used the word sacred. What, can you fill that out just a little bit more? Like, what is it
Yeah.
about living on a farm, right, with your family, like not in a city, that, what is it about that connects time and sacredness together?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I do not, so I'll speak just myself and then extrapolate. I do not experience life as about trying to get somewhere, to get from A to B to C to D. I experience it more as trying to create the conditions to where what is already present in A can blossom, or that A can compound and grow on itself. And that means time has the agency. Now, I have to have a certain, now this is not inactive, because you have to continually, and I would even say faithfully dwell or faithful presence in time in a manner that creates the compounding effect. Michelle and I will sometimes talk about the difference between gathering and compounding. We exist in a society of gathering, when really I think humans flourish when they feel like they're doing something that compounds, right? Like, let's take dialogos or circling or conversation. When you have conversations like this, they feel like they compound, don't they? You get a history, they kind of grow, ideas kind of grow. A critical difference between small talk, dare I say, and something like a dialogos, to speak generally, is not actually the subject material. It's not actually that it's about whether or not versus philosophy. It's about the feeling of the possibility of a compounding, the feeling of the possibility that this can actually develop and become a certain unfolding, that there is actually something always latent that needs time and the proper orientation of the subject to bring out, right? You don't need to go get something. It's all here. You just have to bring it out. So there's a certain compounding structure. Now, the word compounding can be hard to use because people hear that and they think money, like, compounding money or something. But there is something to be said about the faithful work of doing it again that builds something. Because there is something also about, dare I say, the agricultural, and again, these are vast generalities that apply in some areas and not in others. So, I understand that. There's a lot of doing it again. You're doing the dishes again. You're doing the weeding it again. You're doing a thing that's doing it again. But when you're in a situation where it's part of the generations, the families are all here, you have the children, the doing it again does not feel empty. It feels like it is actually maintaining the environment so the thing that is building can keep building. I think a lot of people, as a little note, when they get to the mid years, say between 30 and 60, and they go, oh my gosh, 80% of life is repetitive tasks, and they don't feel like they're compounding, they feel like they're just trying to keep their head above water or gather things together, they become nihilistic. Because they don't feel like the doing it again is maintaining something that is growing through time. They feel like they're just trying to keep themselves from drowning, and they become hopeless. And then they actually are prone to do something extreme and perhaps bad just to feel something different for once. And that's very problematic. But when you get a sense of time has agency, and there's a sense in which you're kind of maintaining the conditions so that the necessary time can go. But the same goes with writing. You work on things, you're trying to do something that compounds, right? Critically, too, I think a lot of people's logic of building is building a resume or building status. That's what they're building. But here's the problem with status. Status requires, it doesn't feel like a skill. It doesn't necessarily feel like enablement. And also your status can feel restricted to the specialized business that recognizes the status, which your family may not, because your family doesn't understand why you're the top of the a nuclear company or whatever, right? They may not, and this is where I think couples end up alienated for one another, because the thing that one partner compounds in actually leads to alienation of the other, right? So you get these kind of isolated compounding logics, right? So for me, when we talk about the agriculture, there is this experience of you are in a space where something is alive that you are participating in making sure stays alive. So time is more, I'm going to say that time, maybe even history, is more in the driver's seat. And you want to actually make people, I suppose, if someone like a Seth visits, there's an idea of, taste it. Experience this unfolding of time. Experience a way of life where kind of time has a certain life of its own. And you're not trying to beat the clock, but in a sense, you're trying to honor time. And you're trying to maintain the space season by season as things grow and develop. And the things you're working on are not just resumes, but capacities that contribute to the environment. Like the ability to speak, the ability to listen, the ability to think, the ability to be hospitable. These are all capacities that are part of the, dare I say, space making, the architecture and the design, as opposed to compounding things that specialize you in a job that may actually make you less able to make a shared space because you are actually more specialized on a capacity, right? So I think what I would say, let me put it this way, and then I'll pass it in any questions, is that I experience life as everything is kind of almost folding, I want to say gestalt, folding into something that is gestalt. Like it is all of the skills you're learning in work, all the ways that you're making money, all of the things you're using your free time toward, Michelle and I kids, it's all actually part of the same logic. Like there's a logic that kind of uniforms it. Now, I know Rosa is basically suggesting that, everyone's in a kind of commodity form logic, economic logic that gets away of resonance, right? It kind of moves away. I think that's very true. I think people in the modern world, if you grant me that, they have one logic when they go to work, another logic when they're at home, another logic when they're doing their hobbies, and they're kind of logic schizophrenic almost. Like there's a kind of schizophrenic in the logics, if you will. Now, there's something to be said about a diversity of logics, but if there's so much dissonance between the logics that they don't harmonize, they just create dissonance, you go mad, right? You have to have, there are different kinds of logics, but there has to be the possibility of connection between them that harmonizes them, right? That's how I experience things. And for me, that starts getting at what it means to talk about the sacred. You start talking about this space where actually you see the music that arises when all of those things are harmonizing together. And it's folding into keeping this thing going, keeping something continual as opposed to it fracturing. And then I think when things fracture, you get alienated. When things feel continual, there's more resonance, if you will. Now, I'll pause. Those are some thoughts.
Yeah. One of the things I was kind of struck by and appreciating the sense of time and in noting this difference, like back and forth, I can feel the difference, right? Which is interesting in just itself. But one of the things I thought about was this, if we say a relationship, right? Another, right? In sacred time. Who is that other? Who am I? What is that relationship, right? What's it doing? Like in the city, at the corporation where I gotta fucking be CEO and produce this thing, right? Because my whole identity is this means of production, right? Like, and then I meet somebody and we have a relationship. Is that a relationship? Who are they? What, I'm just kind of getting this sense of the sense of time. What I appreciate is it's prior to subject object. There's a tonality that probably holds sway and gathers me and you in that relationship in ways that are prior to those structures in some sense. So I'm noticing my mind. I'm like kind of going to one and the other, and I think what I'm hearing is in like identity in, we'll say, linear time, for shorthand, is really banking on what I produced and whether or not it's recognized. It's the recognition from the other is the confirmation and affirmation that I am that person who did that at some level. If you still had the result, but like no one could recognize it, your world would fall apart. Like there'd be no you. You'd realize like all that work that you did was for naught, and all of that. And what I think I'm hearing is my pictures in sacred time is there's that sense of you're actually, the recognition is like for the identity that it's not being recognized. It's my ability to recognize what's developing, right? It's like this, it's like they're reversed, right? Like the role of apprehension and recognition, right, is not needing to be reflected by another so that I exist, but rather like I somehow find myself being a part of something that I am recognizing, right? And in some way, I would imagine that reciprocally reaches back, right? And in a non-narcissistic kind of reflective way, probably shapes me, right? And in fact, it'll shape my tone, like my ability to attune, my skills, like my all. It's constantly being shaped in that relation, but it doesn't have that like identity reification thing that is so prevalent in linear time. Yeah.
No, not to jump in. You're getting at so for me, a lot of the subject-object divide is a result of a mislocation of recognition away from the continuum, the unfolding itself. And what you're doing is recognizing something and wanting to be recognized back. Well, this creates, I want to say, game theory dynamics that are necessarily problematic. And there's going to be, how do I get the recognition? But what ends up happening when you say, or I'll say this, when you're living on a farm that has a history that's been building up, the recognition, everyone recognizes you're part of this. The recognition is this. And so the recognition is pinpointed with the world, not just between I and other. It's pinpointed with the world. So you get a three. So it's not merely, so if you recognize the world the I and other is in, and thus you recognize the other as well, and they recognize you. And you recognize yourself, but in a non-egotistical way. So a lot for me, and look, Rosa was speaking about an inability, resonance being tied with a certain recognition with the world, a certain connection with the world. For me, the question of recognition, because humans want to be recognized, right? Okay, well, the moment you say, I want to be well, you just said I. There's a problem there. Does the I even exist? What do we mean by I? And what do we mean by recognize, right? You want to be recognized. So there's something in human beings that seek a certain recognition, right? Well, the question is, what is that for? Like, what is that for? In the same way that, what is nihilism for? You know, Desmond was alluding to this. Well, I think he's right, to get us into a metaxis where we ask about the enabling condition of everything, to get us back home, right? So it seems like nihilism is a mistake, but in a way, it's actually a kind of, it's an opportunity to get back to the enabling condition, the enabling source. Makes me think a bit of the Kyoto school, et cetera, so forth, right? So recognition, for me, is only, I'll use Desmond's language, is actually only possible in some kind of between space, actually. Any recognition that is sought outside of between space is going to end up leaving the third out you need. It's going to leave out the world. Because if you're in a between space, then how are you here? How is betweenness possible, right? Where is betweenness? Betweenness is only possible if there's a world beyond you that can hold you in the between. The only way there can be an I and other is if there's a world in which I and other can relate, right? So if you don't recognize the world, you actually don't recognize the condition of possibility necessary for otherness, right? So in your efforts to recognize the other, if you don't also pinpoint that with the world, you actually don't recognize the other in their entirety, because you don't recognize the condition of world necessary for them to be other, right? So what ends up happening is you require a certain we want to be recognized by people who recognize us in a context of an unfolding. We don't just want to be recognized as an ego. We want to be recognized as part of something that is unfolding, and we want to be recognized in that with them. We want to be recognized with other people, because then that makes the relation with that person not feel like a waste of time. If I feel like you recognize me in a world with you, then I feel like this relation is not arbitrary. I feel like it matters, right? And I feel like the world is there to say it matters, to confirm it matters, that the world actually affords the possibility of this thing mattering, right? So, in my opinion, we want to be recognized by others deep down in a way that also recognizes our world, and we want to be recognized also in a way that includes them in our world. This is where a relation with stewarding and time is so powerful, because if they're still here, then they do recognize your world. And if you're still here, even if nothing is said, all you do is see them walking by on the street and they see you on the porch, then that is actually, even in the silence, there's a recognition, because they're here. They're participating in the thing that is your world, that if they are here, they are also actually recognizing your existence, because you are fundamentally part of that world, right? So when you get that sort of sharedness, there is always recognition, because there's the recognition of that world that is going on. So, and I think actually in great conversation that occurs as well, because I think in dialogos, circling, there's actually a recognition not just of I and other, but also the metaxis, the world, the space between, of which affords the possibility of otherness, and you enter into resonance. So for me, and then I'll stop, resonance, because Hartmut was defining resonance as the opposite of alienation. Alienation will always occur when you're missing one of the three, either I, other, or world, right? You can be alienated anyway. You can just world, no I and other, you're in trouble. Other and no I, you're also in trouble, because you lose the individual and that becomes mass movements or whatever. You have to have I, other, and world. Then you get the three, and that creates resonance. But you have to get all three of those, and you have to get them all in a certain fluidity, in a certain metaxis, in a certain environment. That creates resonance. But of course, that also requires skill to hold all of those things. There's a skill here. The nervous system, musicality of being, circling. There are skills of holding these things together. So those things come to mind.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that, because I love what you just said about a feeling of belonging has those elements of myself, the other, and the world, right? So, I don't know, someone appreciates me for something, but that does something. It doesn't do the whole thing. I want to feel like I fit in here. I want to, they say a nice thing to me and then they go and, like I want to feel like if I'm in a room full of people, like I'm part of the whole flow of the room. Or at the very least, there's a person in that room that I'm going to be able to find, and we're going to be able to sit and we're going to be able to have a connection. But with Heart Mount Rosa, there's also, so you were just using the word skill, and I also want to bring in the question of awareness. And so I'm thinking again of being at the Circling Institute, and what did I learn? You mentioned already the nervous system, and I can remember, and it'd be great to hear some of Guy's reflections on this too, because when you're circling, if you're the facilitator, you're listening to one person primarily who's sharing, and you're helping them explore, and you have this beautiful phrase, you're trying to get their world. Like, you're not just trying to get them, you're trying to get their world, right? And then there may be other people in the conversation. And then in the training, I might be circling someone, and Guy might be observing how I'm facilitating and then giving me feedback later about that. And so, I know Guy's spent a lot of time thinking and directly being, in this question of the question I want to ask here is what is the kind of awareness that we need to cultivate here? So going back to the conversation you and I had previously, Daniel, we were talking about how common it is in these days for someone to just pull rank. Well, I'm a professor, so I know what I'm talking about, and I'm, or whatever. You couldn't possibly know that because you've only been around here for a little while. Whatever, all the ways that people just cut each other off. And so in circling, we're really in a practice where we're learning how to put all our attention on the other person in an incredibly generous way, where if they do feel alienated, they actually are given, among other things, time, and then the opportunity to notice that, oh, maybe this is a space wherein if I say what I really think, I don't have to wonder if I will lose my belonging, right? So it's already, I sometimes think of not just circling, but a lot of different practices that we would do to develop different forms of awareness as a kind of a petri dish. It's like we take conversation, which is just an everyday experience in anyone's life, but then we slow it way down. And in circling, generally speaking, the attention is mostly with one person, whereas in another conversation, we might be sort of fighting for, well, you told your story for a while, it's time for you to listen to my story. And then, so there's a lot of things that happen there. But out in the world with the polarization and, just in the past couple of days, we now have the states of the United States trying to redraw the lines of the districts. And it's like people are talking throwing around words and phrases like civil war, but it definitely feels like there's a strong current moving opposite everything we're talking about. So while we can't, I think it's very clear we can't sit on a podcast conversation and solve these problems in the spirit of just fleshing things out and sort of seeing, well, what's the next thing that comes alive here? I think there's also a lot of people who are concerned about the situation. And I don't know, maybe more people are going to become curious about things like dialogos and circling and other practices because they're noticing, this isn't working really well. Like even when I get together with, my old buddy, as soon as politics come up, we can barely talk. Or, for some people, if they like two different sports teams, they can't actually navigate the conversation successfully. Well, so, okay, some people could be more skillful with that. And I think doing things like training and circling is really helpful. But another one of the differences out there is that people are in different awarenesses. Some people, as you were mentioning, they might sort of just always live in the same town. And so they're never really challenged to be with difference. Or some people might really think the most important thing is that my side wins the next election, and I just have to spend every minute of every day advocating and pushing that. And, I have to make sure that none of my kids, even listens to the other side. And like, so people are at all different levels of, I would say, curiosity in the thing we're talking about. And if we think that understanding this better is, you know, an important part of humanity's future, and we decide to dedicate time and energy, you know, we can be in spaces where other people share that same desire, and that's really nourishing, and it helps us build our skills. But part of what we have to learn to do is also like, how do I deal with, there could be different degrees, but I'll just say the hostile other. How do I deal with the person who actually, you know, doesn't want to listen, and doesn't want to, that it's too simple to say they don't want to listen, but I mean, we're in a situation now where in our culture, you know, certain words are prohibited in certain spaces, or that thing you mentioned, Daniel, like someone different walks in the room, and before I can help it, I go, ugh, and then I try to act normal, but everyone saw me do that, and suddenly, you know, like, so. Just coming back to Hartmut Rosa, there's another thing that he talks about, which what I really like about it is it's a very specific thing that you can pay attention to, and maybe it's a way of building awareness. He talks about time in terms of 3 levels of time. So he says there's the time you have in the day, and you're kind of like, okay, I'm on this Zoom call, and you know, later I'm going to do this other thing, and I have to keep track of that. Then he talks about the time you have in your life, like, oh my gosh, I'm almost 50 years old. What have I done? You know, how can I make this life, you know, worthwhile before I leave? And then there's historical time. Oh, okay, this is like the dawn of AI. You know, we might have similar interpersonal dynamics that would have been relevant 100 years ago, but now they're taking place within this technological acceleration. And so from the little that I got, you know, if I'm living a good life these days, a life full of resonance, I would, at least for myself, make peace with the time in my day. I would make the peace with the time I have in my lifetime. And I would make peace with, okay, this is the historical time I live in. So, you know, maybe I'm happy with the culture, maybe I'm not happy with the culture, but this is the culture as it is. So how do I swim through these currents? And the question I wanted to sort of give back to both of you, that has been on my mind. So, you know, I could do all kinds of work that I might think of as self-development. Myself, do I feel comfortable? But it really strikes me these days that, and this is something I learned in circling, is like, I'm really trying to track the other person I'm with. I mean, of course, you always see the other person you're with, but like, noticing, oh, they sped up, or they slowed down, or they just seemed like they got a little tense, or oh, they relaxed, and like, so yeah, you mentioned the musicality of being, and I like to think of the music of our conversation, but really noticing, oh, the music just changed, or maybe the music feels the same for me, but it looks like the music might have just changed for this other person, and it's kind of a tall order to, you know, because feels like a lot just to keep track of myself, but it seems that there's a growing need for us to develop, a friend of mine used this phrase, other awareness. It's like we're really like, I'm here with you, but I'm almost imagining what it's like to be you, even while I'm knowing what it's like to be me and trying to, you know, have my experience, but I'm almost imagining your experience of being with me while I'm with you, if that makes any sense. It strikes me that that's kind of, I mean, when I find that I feel like I'm doing that, and to some degree having some, that's when I feel more in flow. It's not just because I have a sense that I'm doing well. It's like I have a sense of our music.
Yes.
Just real again, you said doing that. What's that again?
Well, you know, the way I think of it, because I've been doing this specific thing recently, it's like I could talk to you guys and just really narrow down into the Zoom screen. But when I notice the cars driving outside, when I notice that the rest of my kitchen is over here, and then when I kind of even imagine that you have all of that happening too. Or I
Right.
noticed how you're sitting and you just shifted. It's like, even though I can't help but have most of my attention inside my skin, it's like I'm trying to have this intimacy or imagine
Yeah.
this kind of intimacy
Mm-hmm.
out on my skin, even into yours or something like that.
Mm.
Yeah. Your question, just I want to respond to your question about like what kind of awareness, right, does it take, right, or that invites sacred time relation, say, um, and that sense of reciprocality. Like it is that there is that level, like you say, in intimacy, John's word for this is this reciprocal, accelerating mutual self-disclosure, rapidly accelerating mutual self-disclosure. That there's something about when I say and I disclose myself, right? I dwell in you in such a way that you then come and co-dwell in me in some way that has me respond, right? And there's an exercise that we do in circling, because a lot of circling is about, and this is really interesting because most if you think about it, this most conversations have like a structure, there's me, you, and then there's the thing I'm talking about, right? And usually if we connect about this thing, right, the relationship goes in a particular way. If we don't, the relationship goes another way, right? Very rarely, though, is that third thing the relationship itself, right? Where what we're addressing, right, is the thing that's happening right now in the moment, right? And it's interesting because it's so interesting. I've always been struck by this, right? About if I want to make someone, if I want to put us like make us really anxious or like alive, all I got to do is just start talking about what it's like for me being with you right now. If I bring it right into the moment, right? Like, and I say, yeah, I'm noticing Daniel's not drooling as much, and I'm feeling uh my my heart open with him, and then I noticed, and now I'm noticing Seth is smiling and looks like he's dancing, and I want to then dance. There's this quality of like when the address becomes the relation,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like this, like it's weird. Something in us knows that, understands that. Like there's something that understands we are now in a different dimension, right? Like, and I think the dimension is this. I think it's that place of, I would imagine what Hartman was talking about is like I forget how he talks about it exactly, but he says like where it's that resonance doesn't have a guarantee, right? Is what allows it to be, right? It's the realm of uncontrollability, right? Um, that's one of the things that, for residents, you need that precondition of it could possibly not be, right? In some sense. And there's something about that uncontrollability that seems to that dimension, right, opens up the moment I start getting honest about what it's like being with you right now and revealing myself. I don't know what I'm gonna say. I don't know what you're gonna say, right? There's this element where the conversation is us in some way. And so one of the ways that we play with that to show this mutuality is we'll do an exercise where like you sit across from somebody, you just make eye contact for a moment, and then somebody just says, yeah, being with you right now, I'm experiencing, right? And then you just describe whatever it is that you're experiencing in relationship with them being with them. And then the other person says, hearing that, now I'm experiencing da, 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 right? And you get feedback. And the other person says, hearing that, and you just stay in the moment, but all you're doing is you're doing this back and forth. And inevitably, most of the time, people experience getting so high from that.
Yeah, it's like it's
right?
electric.
Yeah, yeah. It's like it's like yeah, it's people get really, really, really energized, right? Really struck, really surprised. Um, and I think that that exercise in some sense starts to it keys in on this radical openness that we are for the other, right? This radicality of openness, right? That we are. And so when we both turn and face each other and face the facing, right? There's like there's an energy there that can unfold that I think is telling about how forming relationships are for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, and when I've brought some of these kinds of uh, processes to people I work with, one of the questions that's come up, and I'm imagining it's come up for you as well, guys. So I'd be curious. But like I did a week-long training once where I invited people to come and work with some of these skills, and you know, things like paraphrasing. If someone is speaking to you and you tell them what you heard them say, and then they have the opportunity to say, well, actually, it's not quite what I said. But so one of the things that does is it establishes we're actually talking about the same thing, and it builds trust. But like another kind of incredible thing that I learned because it was at the Circling Institute that I first sort of like paraphrasing as a thing. There's a reason to do it. Is like people just hear what they just said back, and they hear something they said that they didn't realize that they said. So I was sharing that and some of these other kinds of things for a week. And then what people often would say is, you know, this is great and I love what we're doing here, but my spouse didn't come. And when I talk to them, like, you know, they still don't listen to me. And now I'm seeing how important it is to listen and how it all changes, but they won't do it with me. And then at the same time, sometimes there would be a person who would say, well, actually, my husband didn't come to the workshop, but I listened to him based on what we did here. And he just said something to me like I've never heard him say for the last 20 years. You know, he opened up. But I was curious to hear your experience, Guy, of people talking about, okay, I have these great experiences at the Circling Institute, but then when I go and I meet these other people who don't do this training, like, how do you respond to that? Because, or maybe you have some stories that came up, but I'm just really curious because what I noticed in our conversation is, and I think there's a real importance and a value in talking about kind of like the skills that we would ideally have and the awareness that we would ideally have. But I also want to bring into the conversation the sort of the gap that's often there in our world right now. And if we are trying to intentionally work on this, you know, without thinking that we're going to go evangelize something everywhere we go, but just how we show up, is there a way that we can use our own development of an awareness in relationship to help just set something in motion out there that moves in a different direction than what we're kind of seeing in the mainstream of politics right now?
You know, it's interesting. I did this talk like a long time, like a while ago. It's like 20 years ago, and I think it was on intimacy. And before the talk, as I was getting ready for it, I wanted to figure out if it was possible, being the only child that I am, if with two people, if one person just was intimate, if one person was just on board, could you still be intimate? Is there a way that, like, I wanted to know, like, no matter where the other person is, if I can have a sense of intimacy with this person, right? And they don't have to do anything, right? I can just do the whole thing. I wanted to know if you could do that. And I don't know if this is correct, but I like drew circles and I like did geometry, and every single fucking angle I looked at, right? I couldn't get past the sense of that there is something fundamental. There's a fundamental reciprocity, right? That needs to happen for both people, right? it's kind of like this is the way I like to get it. It's like I can love you with all my heart, and I can communicate it to you. Like I can share it. I can write poetry. I can write songs. I can stand on my toenails and spin around and like in every imaginable way I can try to like transmit to you that I love you. But the one thing I can't do is give you the experience of being loved by me, right? That, like, fortunately or unfortunately, we're fundamentally free in that way, right? So I think there's just something fundamental about like relationship genuinely is participated by both people, right? Um, that being said, that it's interesting because like the longer I've been doing circling, the more and more and more I'm struck by how important and how fundamental listening is. And it's interesting because usually when you think about like communication, most people when they think about like I'm going to become a better communicator, or do you go to the bookstore and there's probably like a whole bookshelf of on communication, and most of them are going to be about basically talking about what to say, how to say it, in what way to say it, right? Like when not to say it. And then there'll be some little chapter or something about the importance of listening, right? Um, but when you really think about this, like I'm convinced that if you actually want to be a really good communicator, and all you do is learn how to listen, that's that will draw because speech, right, is always presupposes a listening. In fact, speech only makes sense if there's a listener there, right? So, and my speech is only as powerful as it speaks into the listening, right, of the person. So it's not like my ability to know how to say things in cool ways, right, or even knowing what to say. It's am I able to locate and hear the others listening? And so what that means is that like listening is more fundamental to like to conversation than anything, right? And so how do I hear another's listening is I hear it, right? This tuning in, this being attuned. And I would say that like in terms of like what you were talking about, bringing this out in the world and the difference that makes the difference of being able to like have a higher quality connection with somebody, right? Even if they don't have any idea that there is such a thing, is that it's your ability. What brings that, I think, that makes that the most possible. It's your ability to hear, right? What matters to them, what they're caring about. It's your ability to read things in them as animating in disclosure of care. Like everyone's always there's a sense there's some horizon of a future that everyone is leading into, right? By the fact of their existence, right? You can notice these things, and as you notice that, you can address them in some way, right? You can just respond to them. And I think it's more about that ability to hear and be responsive, right, to the other person. And a lot of times, like if you get like is my friend Mark Lewis would always like to say, beauty is only as deep as the observer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as you get as you, because I think reading philosophy has, if anything, what it's granted me, it's afforded my ability to perceive,
Yeah.
right, much more deep,
Mhm.
right? It's not. I have a bunch of information in my head, right? It's that's not it. It's afforded me the more of an ability to one be attracted to what I don't understand and hear the call of that, hear the call of it, and be responsive to it, right? And I think that when you start to respond, you develop your attention and you develop your listening, right? You develop your palate, right, in a certain sense. Um, and the depth that you can do that is the more, like the more of the person has to do less and less for me to hear more and more, right? And and as I can hear something that they don't understand that they're communicating that's more true than anything else that they said, and I could just like be in response to it in some way, right? I think that's the key to it because I think that in as far as I can tell, although there's a lot of skills involved in relating, I don't think relation is a skill. I think it's a capacity, right?
Fair.
It's a capacity. Um, and so, it's that deepening. Whenever we talk about like developing a capacity, right? Now we're in the element of development of like our whole being, right? So that's the sense of it. Like, for me is it's less knowing. Yeah, it's more about the ability to hear and respond to the multidimensionalness of that person, right? It's not knowing what to say and how to say it, and right,
Yeah.
all that stuff. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to hear what Daniel's thinking, but just two quick things. So another thing that I did with you guys at the Circling Institute, another one of the exercises, is listening in such a way that I could then say, something I think I'm getting about you is, and it was a very carefully constructed sentence, something I think I'm getting about you. I'm not saying I know this about you, but it's kind of like, based on how you're showing up, I'm starting to guess at some of the things, like you said, that are being communicated, but might not be literally being put into words. And then I love what you say about philosophy. The value isn't just all the information in my head, but it's helping your perception. And I mean, what seems really basic to me is, if we are looking at some kind of conflict in the culture, I mean, it's when I say the words, it sounds so dumb, but it's like if you say everyone here is human, like we have that in common, don't we? But then if I take what Guy was just speaking about, being human has an infinite number of layers to it. And so this person who I might feel violent disagreement with on a particular topic, there are all these other layers that I could be listening to. And I think care is also a universal, right? We're all, I haven't read Heidegger, but I know there's that idea of the being towards death, like death, like family. We all have some of these basic things. And so it would seem that, yeah, if you and I are in conflict, one of the things that I have to do is make the conflict not the only salient thing. Like the fact that we are both human, which seems so obvious as to almost like, make some snide remark about why is that important. But actually the fact that we have two humans here is also the potential for a connection, for some kind of unity. But I know that Daniel's got all kinds of stuff bubbling, so I'm going to pass it over his way.
Well, I appreciate very much everything that's being said, and I like that idea of relation as a capacity more than a skill. It almost would seem to me, perhaps it is this, that architecture is the skill, that you can have skills that can facilitate capacities, but ultimately the relation has to be a capacity. Because when I think about stewarding, there's something about setting the stage, thinking about the certain skillfulness to create the place that affords the capacity or that makes space for the capacity. But the key that I think you're getting at is skill can never replace capacity. And capacity in this sense seems to be a certain reciprocity. Like you said, you can't force someone to accept your love of the other. Well, theologically, oddly, even God can't force you to love him, right? Like not even God can force you to love him, right? There's something very interesting about that. Like there are some traditions that say hell is the experience of God if you hate him. Like God cannot force you not to experience him as hell then. God cannot force you to experience him as heaven, right? Because of this element of freedom. Um, Now, without getting much into it, I think we are also alluding in all of this to the million. I mean, that problem right there is alluding to me, the current split between modern and classical philosophy, which is where the world is currently stuck, which is modern philosophy said, hey, you need to give people freedom to determine good for themselves, otherwise you'll get totalitarianism. And more classical philosophy is like, hey, freedom without the good leads to nihilism. So what you gonna do? And we're like, okay, so should we tell people what the good life is? Obviously, Rosa was like, the problem with sociology today is nobody wants to say what the good life is. Well, if you say what the good life is, couldn't you end up in totalitarianism? Oh, but if you don't say what the good life is, you get, well, a lot of isolated, atomized people in their freedom, right? So there's a massive problem here that I also think is getting at this. I'm now just thinking a bit on this capacity skill situation, where the skill is needed to kind of create the architecture that is increasing the probability that directs people to a relational capacity. So you're using skill to direct people to the capacity, but then they have to step into the capacity, right? All you can do is try to skillfully point to it or create spaces that open them to it, but you can't do the work. Like all God could do, if you take this, is send a model of Jesus and, hey, here's a model, and then you kill him, but that's about it. There are spaces God can open up, or you could say beauty is pointing to the capacity, but beauty itself can't be the capacity. It can call forth the capacity. It can suggest the need for the capacity, but there's still a work there. So there's an interesting interplay between skill and capacity that I think is actually speaking to the problem between modern and classical thought, between freedom that leads to nihilism and a direction of the good that doesn't lead to totalitarianism, right? Like, and figuring out those things together, I think, is part of this kind of, I want to say, dialectic between skill and capacity that is very interesting. I think also, Guy, what you were saying about philosophy being about an increase of awareness, yeah, it is. Ivan Illich is like, hey, this is all about awareness. Simone Weil, it's all about awareness. McGilchrist, Basecamp, it's all about awareness. Awareness is ethical. Basically, philosophy starts in phenomenology or it's nothing. Like you start with the question of, I am having
Those are fighting words.
Yeah, I know, right? It's like, it starts with the question of, I have this awareness. So what must the conditions of reality be like to give me this awareness? And from the phenomenon, you then move to the ontological. But what you experience in phenomenon is relative to your capacities, because that's also the key. The problem is having a phenomenology that is not alive. Much phenomenology has not been tied to actually what you experience and can ask conditions of reality about are not conditional to what the subject develops. And that's been the great, in my opinion, one of the downfalls of phenomenology is separation from virtue ethics. Once you do that, then phenomenology is nothing more than a very odd objective science. But when you say, no, what humans can experience is relative to their virtue, and then if I'm able to increase capacities and experience people differently, what must the conditions of reality be like to allow me to have different conditions based on virtue? Oh, now we have a living reality that entails conditions that are afforded by virtue, afforded by experience, afforded by openness to the other, as opposed to a kind of objective, bland phenomenology that is saying, what does no person in particular experience? And then what are the conditions of reality based on that no person in particular experience? Well, that's a confused phenomenology. Now, I'm saying a lot here, but basically, I think the separation of virtue from phenomenology has gotten us into trouble, because then we are separating phenomenology from the question of a moving and growing awareness that can be afforded by relationality. But if we take those things seriously, I think we get into a lot. On the extremely important questions of hostility, other people who don't care, all of these very important topics. Some thoughts that come to mind. First off, I'm of the opinion that most people actually don't care enough about what they care about. They say they care about football, but actually they just passively consume it. And a way to create intimacy is actually to help someone realized they didn't actually care about the things they cared about. And instead of changing them, what you actually are then doing is creating a space to help them realize that their care is not deep. And then once their care becomes deep, that actually changes their subjectivity that can open them up to intimacy. Because one of the reasons why people are not intimate is because they don't know depth is possible. They don't know it's possible in anything. And if somebody has a passion for, I'm just going to say football, for example, the problem is their love of football has never actually brought them to depth. It's brought them to entertainment, interest. It's past the time. It's past the time, but it has not brought them to a space of a deep encounter with reality, right? And so there's also an issue where there's the strategy of how do I get someone to care about what I care about? And then there's the strategy of how do I help that person actually find the depth in their own care that they have not experienced, and that you are learning to actually create and facilitate that. That then creates intimacy with you, that then makes them more receptive to the thing that you want them to do or to experience for their own sake, right? So there's something here about, there's a problem in a sense where people are not passionate enough. And one of the reasons why I think we're seeing so much hostility is because people are not able to be passionate about, say, what they love. The only way they experience passion is rage and anger. Like the anger we are seeing is the feeling of a people that finally get passion, or a feeling of something like passion, who don't know how to get it according to their own internal capacities and development, right? And that actually then leads to a kind of simulacra, a certain counterfeit of what passion is supposed to do. In my experience, and this is just anecdotal and I cannot prove it, I have never experienced the radical hateful hostility. There might be shortness, there might be a moment of blah, but this deep hatred hostility, I do not experience that readily from people that have truly fallen head over heels passionately in an intrinsic motivated way with something. And certainly not from people that have had the deep experience of beauty, because that shatters categories and removes certainty in a manner that keeps you porous. Because hatred and self-certainty are tied together. It's an entirely different subject, but I think it's relevant, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. Also, I think one of the things you can also do, as I'll just say quickly, the antidote to hostility is hospitality, and you do that by pinpointing the relation off the world. So instead of directly facing the person that's hostile, you try to create a space. You try to actually work on the world to create an environment that incubates a different response out of them, which gets into this, like if they don't have the capacity for relation, then for me, it's on the skill side. Then it's on the skilled of working the world to the place that makes them feel safer, that makes them feel like they don't need that hostility. And then from the skillfulness, you then work to the capacity. Hopefully, now, if you do the skill and you don't have the capacity, then it's not going to get anywhere. But there is certain sort of skillfulness. Like, I'll give an example. Like, I have found when I was dealing with more, say, debate or more hostile situations, just almost as a line, like literally a kind of script would be, I don't agree, but I could be, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I could be wrong. So can I ask you some questions to better understand your view? And the reason why I do that is because I'm telling the person I'm willing to change, but I need to be able to ask some questions. And the reason is because what have I done? If they say yes, of course, I've invited them into a Socratic dialogue where I'm just going to ask them why. And I'm going to get them to the source of their own view, which will force them to see if it is justified or not. And what I'm not doing is saying that they're wrong. I'm offering myself to be convinced by them, but I'm just saying I need to be able to, I don't agree with you, but let me ask you some questions so I can get it, right? That sometimes can be just a kind of helpful rule of thumb as a strategy. It's like, I don't agree with you, but I also could be wrong. So can I ask you some questions to better understand your view? And if they say no, you say, well, there's nothing I can do then. Because if you don't answer these questions, I can't change because I don't know, right? So you're inviting them to a possible space of aporia. You're opening a kind of clearing. The main thing I wanted to say, there's so many things because this is also important. I appreciate the space. I've been thinking a lot about why the tree is called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This is very odd. Why isn't it just called the tree of knowledge of evil or knowledge of good? Why the tree of knowledge of good and evil? This is very strange. Well, one of the reasons I've been thinking about this is because people are they're worst when they think they're good and you're evil. Like the combination of good and evil is what destroys the world. Not just evil, it's I know you're wrong, I know I'm good, and so good and evil creates a thing where I actually can treat you like crap and I'm not a monster because I'm moral, right? And so like some of the worst atrocities in history occur when someone who was legitimately mistreated by someone else turn around and get to do something to that person that genuinely mistreated them, right? Because this revenge is justice. This revenge is the good that is actually bringing justice to the evil. And that can be when all bets are off, right? That is, I think, the characteristic of hostility in the world today. It is a knowledge of good and evil. Like if you support this, it is evil, and therefore it must be stopped because we are good. And if we are good, then it invites basically anything, right? And I've been thinking about that a lot because I also constantly come back to the question of forgiveness. Forgiveness, I'm more and more thinking about, and I bring this up because I think it's part of this conversation, because basically nothing is possible without forgiveness. Ultimately, forgiveness is the fail-safe of all possible hostilities, interactions, whatever. And if we as the human race cannot handle forgiveness, it's over. It's just a matter of time before the event occurs and then it's done, right? I've been thinking about more and more about forgiveness as giving back the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Because if you hurt me, and I know you hurt me, and I know you're evil, like we're all relativists until it comes to forgiveness. No, I'm not going to forgive that person. They treat me like crap. Like relativism, the falsity of relativism is completely unveiled when it comes to forgiveness. Because we're like, no, that person's an a-hole, right? We are moral absolutists. We are moral absolutists and fundamentalists when it comes to forgiving. Like, there's no such thing of good and evil until you ask me to forgive that person. Then there's very much good and evil, right? And in a funny way, the problem is, in a sense, we're not, again, I'm being cheeky, but I think it's true. There's a sense in which one of the reasons we're cut off ultimately from sacred spaces is because we're not relativistic enough, actually. Because what I mean by that is if we're truly like, I don't know what good and evil is, so yes, I'm going to forgive you. I actually don't know that knowledge, then I'm porous now, and I am open to the other person, right? Because I've actually made the space open again, right? And the problem is, right now, there's a way in which people's denial of good and evil and not wanting to speak of the good life is actually ultimately, it ends when people feel there's an injustice. When they feel as if someone has done something wrong, then no, they absolutely are going to tell you what the good life is. I mean, that's the reason I also bring this up is because when Rosa is saying no one today wants to say what the good life is, no, they don't, not directly, but in the issue of are you willing to forgive or not, lots of people will suddenly claim what the good life is. Not forgiving those people. That the good is not doing that. The good life is not forgiving those evil Nazis over there or whatever, right? The bad life would be doing it, right? So there actually is a certain sort of assertion of the good life, but it is in a manner that blocks out the other, right? And we have the knowledge of good and evil. We know that you're evil, we're good, and that's injustice, so we have the knowledge of good and evil. Forgiveness is giving back the knowledge of good and evil to open up to a mystery, really. And that's what Jesus ultimately does, right? He dies on the cross and basically is denying the knowledge of good and evil because, he's basically saying, I am going to actually suggest that we don't have, like the way good and evil operates is beyond our abilities to categorize it. And that forgiveness is actually a radical, even insane reminder of that openness. Now, we have to get into the question of wisdom with forgiveness, because if you know if somebody is dangerous and you're saying that I can't be around them because they literally could hurt me, there is a difference between that and unforgiveness, because it's not really bitterness. It's simply wisdom. It's like, this person is dangerous, therefore I'm apart. But you can actually, here's the key. In that wisdom, you're actually not being unforgiving. You're saying, in a sense, I literally can't forgive them because they're not open to receive the forgiveness. And this is kind of the key move. If someone is not open to you, it's not that you don't forgive them. There's a sense in which you can't forgive them, not that you're unwilling, but that you can't, and you have to be wise about that to not put yourself in the dangerous space or not put you in the safe where you're going to be abused and et cetera, so forth, right? So there's an issue of wisdom with forgiveness, but I think people are conflating that with unforgiveness, right? But there are issues there. But ultimately, I guess what I want to say, and I just bring this up and then I'll stop, is that I think one of the key reasons people are not reciprocal, they don't have that reciprocity, is because there's some sort of knowledge of good and evil that is keeping them from opening to the other. Somewhere in them is some kind of knowledge of good and evil that is holding them back. What is that knowledge of good and evil? Maybe they feel like you didn't give enough attention to their interests. Maybe they feel like every time they talk, you don't listen to them, and that's wrong, so then it's okay not to listen back. I think the number one thing that holds people back from one another is a knowledge of good and evil somewhere. And forgiveness is the ultimate dissolver of that. And if you don't forgive, you're not giving back the knowledge of the fruit of true and evil. So you're repeating the fall, basically. You're repeating the fall over and over again, because you're taking the knowledge. And I also would be another topic. I think sometimes, like, could Adam have stayed in the garden if he wouldn't have blamed the woman? You know, because what was the first thing when God said, did you eat from that tree? He's like, she made me do it. I wonder if Adam would have said, yes, I did. If God's like, don't worry about it. That actually the blaming of Eve is actually the key problem, because he has the knowledge of good and evil. She did something wrong. I'm good. She's evil, right? So that meant he really ingested the knowledge of good and evil. But if he would have eaten from the tree and then said, it's my fault, that would have been giving the fruit back. And God would have been like, don't worry about it. Let's take that walk. I think about that sometimes. I can't prove that, but I think about that a lot. It was when he blamed Eve that he acted on the knowledge of good and evil, because she's evil, I'm good. And that was the fall, not just the eating of the tree, but the putting it into action with the blaming of Eve. And I think that's what we're doing to this very day. It's not the having of the knowledge of good and evil. It's when we act out on it, and then boom, we shut off. And then, of course, what's so interesting is it's Adam before the fall, and then it's Adam and Eve after the fall. It's not Eve until after the fall. It's just man and woman. It's after the fall they get different names, because they're actually have that radical intimacy. But I think there is I think when people are not open to the other, there is a knowledge of good and evil lurking that is blocking them. It could be subconscious. It may need body. It may be practices to get out. But I often think that's what's going on. But I will stop.
Blame. Such an interesting thing. Like, it seems to be most hostility, right, has a victim self-righteous dynamic where both people feel like that they're victims and they're therefore right in hurting the other person, right, because they were hurt themselves, right, and thus it just propels, right, that thing. But what's really interesting about this is that the thing that has to happen for that dynamic, it is a dynamic, right, to come into being, is someone has to blame someone. If no one blames anybody, there are no inherent victim, perpetrator, rescuers. Like that whole trinity requires blame. It's really interesting, that thing that you said about blame. You know, and just talking a little bit like about conflict, when people, when stuff asking about like this, like, yeah, but what about when people are assholes to me, right? Or they're mad, or like, it's interesting because, like, if you ask me, all right, Guy, what are what are your personal boundaries or your lines, right? What are the things that like will piss you off and upset you and all that kind of stuff? If you ask me that, I'll probably like come up with something smart to say, but I don't really know where my boundaries are exactly, right? Until the moment you cross them is the moment I know, right? Like the moment you cross them and piss me off, I know exactly where they are. There's something about this this there's something about the importance of conflict in relationship, right? Is that they disclose, right, my own sense of what's most important to me, right? And so it's kind of like, when I get upset, right? Like that's basically telling me that at least interpreted you saying something or doing something that crossed a line, right? That mattered to me. So it's like, the upset or the emotion gives, it lights me up to that. I'm like a sovereign human being, right? I'm not just an amorphic thing. I am actually someone, right? To contend with, right? And it gives me energy to do something about it. Now, if I go right into blame, right? Like that'll go very predictably, right?
Yes.
But like if I actually, and this is much harder to do, right? But if I use that as an opportunity, right? Like say I cross someone else's line and they get pissed off at me. If we use that as an opportunity to go, oh, what was the line exactly? Like what was I being in that moment? When I said that, was I trying to dominate you? Was I manipulating you? What was I doing? Right. And really kind of using that revelation, right, of to get to know the person in their singularity, right, in their unique singularity. And I think you could do that without conflict, but man, within conflict has the possibility of revealing that, right, in a way that I think is really poignant. Um, and what's interesting about that is that if I really know where your lines are, I can fully be myself all the way up to them. Because all the energy is like as close to the boundary as you can get. This is like you talk about humor and play. What is play? But like it's like constantly like pushing the boundaries, like in doing that, right? So there's this quality of like if I know who you are and what matters to you, then I can fully be there. If I don't, right? It's like in something's vague there, and I don't know what's exact. I'm gonna probably like most people will stop way short, right? They'll move away, right? Some people respond by like just running you over and see you as an opportunity, just like whatever. But I think most people like if that's not clear and it's not communicated, will stay further away, and that's the loss of the relationship, or there's less energy or vitality there. Yeah.
As I'm listening
It's
to
kind
you,
of thing. Yeah.
you want to say one more thing? I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to take it in each instance of conflict. It's going to be different, but it also occurs to me that if we come into conflict, if I can have the humility to repair, like the repair could potentially be a deepening of the relationship, because maybe one or both of us is clumsy somehow and we don't see those lines and we cross the line and that's the only way we found out. But then we might really learn the hard way about that line. Daniel was talking about forgiveness, but it occurs to me also the other side is, of course, apology, right? Like I crossed that line. And you were speaking before about listening, Guy, as sort of, okay, there's all kinds of skills, but as a fundamental orientation, if we could really work with listening. And I always loved how you would say in the training that you would pose it as a question, when does listening begin? And it would always be, well, listening begins when you realize you're not listening, right? It's like, oh, I wasn't listening just now. It's time to listen. it exactly reminds me of, I'm meditating. Oh, I wasn't paying attention to my breath. Okay, it's time to pay attention to my breath. It's that wander and return. And for me, when I come into these conversations, I just sort of trust the flow of the conversation. But what I take away that's always super valuable is just like, oh, is there a new distinction here? Is there something new that I can pay attention to that I haven't seen before? And so that idea of where does listening begin? It begins when I realize I'm not listening. I was putting that together with what Daniel was saying about that moment when I become crystal clear that I'm good and you're bad, I'm right and you're wrong. Well, that's got to be the moment where I'm not listening. But usually it's the moment where I'm not listening and I don't yet realize that I'm not listening. I'm just right and you're wrong. And so I'm listening, you're not listening, But if I could redefine that as being not listening, anyway, I just feel like that's a new distinction that I'm hoping will pop up in my head the next time I'm sure I'm right and someone else is wrong, because I might be able to connect it back to this. But in any case, that's what can happen in retrospect when I realize that I've damaged the relationship and it's time for me to apologize. And then in the moment of apology, that too, I just want to say this is also a question of embodiment.
Yes.
I have to get my body okay with saying, whatever it was, I was wrong, now I see it. Or I suppose there could be those moments where I felt justified, but I didn't understand that was a line for you and I was wrong to not have seen it. Or if I had known, I certainly wouldn't have said that or done that. But it really, because to apologize, if we describe how you apologize, like we tell kids, tell them you're sorry, and then the kid repeats it because you said it, but that's not an apology because the kid knows they're just reading the script. But an actual apology or a forgiveness, the two sides of that coin, it's like, it almost feels like I have to begin to adopt a new worldview. I have to live in a world where that wasn't right. Whereas I used to live in a world where what I said was the right thing to say. Now I have to actually discover what it's like to live in a world where I can see why that either wasn't skillful or wasn't sensitive or wasn't, honoring of you or whatever the particular thing is. But and I just, something I'll say right now too, just kind of in the spirit of what Guy said, like coming to the moment, is a difficulty I have in some of these discussions is just like, oh my God, I want to be articulate, but it doesn't seem to be going so well, right? And then the thing for me to do is actually sit here while you guys are waiting for me to finish the sentence and like take my time speaking, which is another thing that I have to do with my body, right? I don't know what you all are thinking, but if I'm nervous, I'm gonna begin to speed myself up with a projection that everyone wants me to get to the point and all of those kinds of things. But if I'm going to actually say, if I'm in the midst of apology, or even if there's no, let's just say there's a need for great awareness because there's a complex thing unfolding, I also have to be willing to slow down the whole situation, even if the momentum is fast. Like I have to be able to kind of be assertive in that I need a slower tempo than we're going. And because I have the mouthpiece, I'm just going to make more space between my words, allow the words to come up rather than force the words out. Because I think a lot of the conflicts, you've spoken to this, Daniel, and again, hearkening back to, I mentioned before, Ezekiel de Paolo, who would talk about certain social interactions will break down when everyone has the best of intentions. But it's some kind of failure to listen or failure to really really embrace that we're participating in something together in this way. So yeah, I think that's what I want. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I think that's a wonderful practice, and that was very articulate. And a lot has been said that is extremely important. So I really like blame, the idea of blame, to focus on that. So to put a little more meat on the bones of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's impossible for me to think about blame without a knowledge of good and evil. If you just had good or you just had evil, you wouldn't have blame. That requires the dynamic of good and evil. You couldn't have victimhood without good and evil in an interplay dynamic, right? Maybe even things like manipulation would require good and evil because I know the good and I'm manipulating it from you, right? So something that I find extremely interesting, hatred seems to be tied to good and evil. And what's very interesting is, in my, again, anecdotal and just reading things and so on and so forth, if you find out that someone is a complete and utter stranger is trying to murder you, and in a sense, it's not good and evil, it's just, in a sense, the knowledge of evil, right? And so you avoid them, you make up defenses, and let's say they get captured by the prison and they go to jail. It seems to me that people actually are able to not hate that person, oddly, because it's just kind of weird. It's like, I didn't know you, we had no relation, and you just wanted to murder me, or you just wanted to see. People seem to have no deep hatred, that very often people don't develop deep hatred toward total strangers or people they don't have relations with them that want to hurt them. The people you hate is someone, hatred requires almost a knowledge of good and evil. Like where there's someone who has the idea that the good is to remove you. Like you have the wrong religion and they're trying to remove you. And so it's good to remove you. This seems to be the kind of person that then it's easy to develop hatred toward because that is evil, right? Because you have a dynamic of good and evil that gets in there. In a funny way, part of the problem is that we stay in the knowledge of good and evil versus move it to just the knowledge of good or just the knowledge of evil. Because there's actually the knowledge of evil that is very just kind of unemotional. It's just kind of matter of fact. Okay, I need to avoid this person. This is dangerous. It seems unforgiving, but it really isn't. It's just like, okay, this is dangerous. So you're trying to remove it. If you knew a stranger was trying to kill you, you might be afraid of them. You might want to avoid them. But what's very interesting is that fear and hatred are different. Fear might be a knowledge of a bad thing. But hatred is a mixture of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you move it from the knowledge of good and evil to good, well, then you open up and you just relate to them, right? Desmond emphasizes metaxis in the between space. The knowledge of good and evil is a between space. The problem is most human beings have a between space in the abstract in their head versus between people. They're wasting their metaxis on the knowledge of good and evil instead of taming that, structuring it to the knowledge of good or the knowledge of evil to maintain a metaxis between people and the world. And there is going to be a between space. You can't avoid it. The problem is most people's between space is abstract, and therefore it's a kind of false between space because it's all in the head. It's not actually a between space, right? So for me, the reason I bring all this up is because I think about stewarding as creating spaces that remove the knowledge of good and evil. There's knowledge of evil, there's knowledge of good, but you're trying to remove the knowledge of the good and evil, which creates things like victimhood and hatred. Those are the things that destroy the sacred. That is what makes us not porous. That makes us shut down from the other person. I do not, when I have the knowledge of someone is trying to murder me who I'm afraid, and it's not a dynamic of the knowledge of good and evil, it actually becomes quite oddly, it seems much easier for people to actually relate with that person later on if they stop wanting to murder them. Because, it's just a mental illness. What's that, guy?
They'll need less therapy. Like if it's my mom trying to murder me, I need a lot of therapy.
Yeah, but there's a therapy, right? It's like there's a treatment. It's not a hatred. There's some sort of development that needs to occur. Hatred requires the knowledge of good and evil. And I've just more and more wanted to stress that because again, it's just kind of weird. I think we often basically treat the knowledge of good and evil as the knowledge of evil, is ultimately what we do with that tree in the Garden of Eden. We don't treat it as an and, we treat it as, we kind of forget about the good part, and we just kind of say it's the knowledge of evil, and it opens sin. Well, sin has a dynamic of a betweenness of good and evil, and that's when you see the most horrible destructions in human history. You don't see mass horrors from people that are simply going after who they think is evil. People, if they think it's evil, they're like, they mostly avoid or stay away, or, but to go after someone, it requires this knowledge of good and evil, right? So for me, so much of hostility that people have is because they're in a knowledge of good and evil versus a knowledge of good or a knowledge of evil, right? And when they're in that sort of space, they develop a certain anxiety that comes out in a passionate state, that because they don't have a thing to pour their passion in, because they don't have a steward or connection with sacred time, this becomes their religious catharsis, and it becomes a Noah's flood. And so it is critically important for us to move the knowledge of good and evil to simply a knowledge of evil or knowledge of good. And for me, stewarding and spaces is, how do you create spaces that keep out the knowledge of good and evil? How do you do that? And if you can do that, and it's skill and capacity, but ultimately capacity, and again, I appreciate that distinction. That is where I think you experience the sacred. I think the sacred comes forth. I think the sacred comes through. And I think experiences of beauty are much more probable to occur. And that's where you also feel intimacy. Intimacy explodes in spaces where the knowledge of good and evil has been given back, where it has been surrendered. And that also compounds and builds and grows and develops something. So I think about stewarding as creating space that remove the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah. Warner talked about, he said, affinity, having affinity, right, for someone, which I think about as like an unreasonable amount of liking, right, for someone. He said it is always a function of communication. And he said communication, the way he would distinguish it was, I thought this was really poignant. He's like, yeah, if you and I have a relationship, and like I communicate my concerns, and I get the sense that you understand my concerns and you're in consideration of those concerns. If that keeps happening, affinity grows. But when we communicate and I feel like you don't care about my concerns, or you don't know what my concerns are, or I try to communicate my concerns, but you don't care about them, right? That's where that starts to breed complaints, right? And complaints are the things that kind of erode intimacy. And it's that place of where, this is one of the big things about listening, right? Is kind of like, you could say interpersonally, at least, right? The mind's way of managing anxiety is judgment, right? Like, and it's interesting because when you think about to judge a person versus judging a thing, right, are very different, right? Yes. But when I judge, and by judgment, what I'm going to say here with this is that, like, what I mean is judgment has two things involved. Like, usually there's some discernment, but in order for it to be interpersonal judgment, right, it has to have a hook of identity, right? So it's when I say, like, I address your behavior, which I may have some discernment in it, right? But when I say I'm addressing your fucking behavior again, right? You can hear it, right? There's that sense of like, I know who you are. This, right? You are that, right? And this is where we get into Korzymski's stuff about, like, this bad abstracting, right? Where you stop becoming this unfolding singularity, right? And when I judge you, right, I fix you, right? I confuse you with my conception of you. And then what ends up happening is that every time I see you and everything that you say just becomes, I just collect evidence to be right about you. And it's interesting because when you think about that, that's like, it's a way of managing chaos, right? Because
Yeah.
if I go like, you're in some way that for whatever reason, right, like rattles my cage. If I just go, oh, you're just, and I just sum that up, you're just this, or that's just that. Now like I'm separated from it, right? It's over there and I don't have to relate with it, right? And so this it's kind of like this sense of I mean having I mean one of the things I've done this a few times where I'll go and work with families, uh, um, where I'll go and like live with them for 2 or 3 weeks and just which has been I probably have learned more from those
Mm.
experiences than almost anything, right? Um, and it's so interesting because a lot of what ends up happening is starting from this level of like just built up resentment and judgment that forms like a dynamic, right, called the family drama. And what's weird is the drama, like dramas drama is dramatic because why it's so dramatic is because it's trying to get rid of the drama,
Yep.
right?
Yes.
That's why it's
Yes.
dramatic. It's just get rid of the drama. Like it's got this self right fulfilling thing, right? And all of that. And so like a lot of times what would happen would be an example would be, I'll be sitting in the kitchen before everyone else wakes up, and then mom gets up and she comes into the kitchen and she's starting to make breakfast, let's say, and she's already pissed off because she just knows that like no one's going to appreciate her and how much work that she does, right? And then the kids like come running out and they don't even acknowledge her, and then they complain about the thing, and then she gets upset, and then the dad comes out is going to finally like whatever the thing is, right? Um, and I'll be back in the corner and I'll be like, the dynamic is cocked, ready, and ready to take the family dump, right? And right before it
Yes.
does, I'll be like, pause, like kind of freeze frame everything, and then start to help them unpack it, right? Unpack it, right? Um, which is basically like getting them to actually talk about what their experience is versus what their assertion is about what's happening and who should do what, right? Uh, and it has a lot to do with that, like wherever, and I just noticed this, like wherever there's those like fixed, like like senses of you are this and you did that to me and all of that kind of stuff, right? Is underneath that is that there was something that happened, right? That was extraordinarily chaotic for that person, right? And they just couldn't tolerate it and they clenched down and it never really, really got addressed, right? That over time. Um, and so what ended up happening is that like then at some point you could feel the dynamic or the drama drop. And we left the level of the drama. And now here you are with people that are standing before each other, designed to love each other, and in the real pain, the real tragedy gets revealed, which is like, here we are, like designed to love the shit out of each other, and I don't know who you are, right? And then begin to articulate and begin actually making contact and touching that. But that is I forget exactly why I started all that, but
I think it's so huge, and for me, drama equals the knowledge of good and evil, and the knowledge of good and evil self-feeds, and what ends up happening is most people's lives are at the mercy of the dynamic of their knowledge of good and evil that gets a life of its own that they cannot stop, right? because the mother that feels underappreciated, it's good to be appreciated. And she probably isn't appreciated, right? So it's like, it's true. And yet, if people act on their knowledge of good and evil, drama is what destroys people's lives. And drama is an emergence of the knowledge of good and evil it becomes people's relationships. And their relationships are sacrificed to the dynamics and here's the key. Most people are trying, like you said, the drama emerges from people trying to stop the drama. The problems of the knowledge of good and evil, people try to stop with their knowledge of good and evil. And so it just goes on forever and ever and ever. It's and you mentioned Korbisky. The whole map is indestructible. It's about Mr. Alfred. I've said Korbisky. I don't know how to use words. Sanity and Science is like the most important book. Alfred Korbisky, he's a big deal. He's a huge deal. And I adore this man. And basically, if you just took all of his, he's like, hey, basically everyone's problems is because they stopped their world from going into an abstraction. If you could just bring it back down here, you'd get sanity. And that's what you're doing in circles. Like, let's just talk about the experience of us talking. What are you doing? You're bringing it back down. Korbisky's like, mental health all depends on that. Mental health is all that. The ability to bring it back into the metaxis. If you don't do that, you get a mental health epidemic. And that's what he said at the beginning of the 20th century. Nobody read it because why read important books? I just wanted to say that what you're saying about drama, creating drama is the interplay of the knowledge of good and evil. And people try to solve the knowledge of good and evil with other knowledge of good and evil. And so it just self-feeds. The only way to stop the knowledge of good and evil is to give it up, to give the fruit back, to surrender it. Otherwise, it self-feeds. And the way you do it, when you're like, it's a beautiful, what you're saying is pause. You're bringing it to the dynamics, to the people. And when you bring it from the abstract to the real, you could give up the abstraction because the knowledge of good and evil is an abstraction. And so if I can bring it back to the face, there's the possibility of giving up. And ultimately, this is my point. At the end of the day, if we as the human, dare I say something grandiose, if we as the human being, we're able to forgive in all possible circumstances, then it is not the case that the effort to bring it to the face must ever necessarily fail. Because the last test will always be, the hardest one will be forgiveness, right? And you can't forgive till I bring it from the abstract to the concrete. And if I can bring it here, as long as I know at the end of the day, we're going to be able to do the forgiveness thing, then we'll be okay. We'll be okay. Because if it comes to that point, we'll be able to get through it, right? And that is the fail-safe. That is the final question. But it starts with bringing it here, instead of the knowledge of good and evil, the dynamic, the drama. Bring it here, not the knowledge of good and evil, but the knowledge of you. The problem is most people have a knowledge of good and evil. They don't have a knowledge of you, and a knowledge of you is called awareness. It is called attention.
Structurally, it's interesting because when you bring it down the level of abstraction to where you're just describing your experience, it's impossible to argue that.
Yes.
Right? It's unarguable. That's
no
how
knowledge.
You know that.
Yeah.
It's like, you can't say, I could say like, yeah, when you said that, I felt really scared and I had judgments about you. Like, you can't really say, no, you didn't.
No. So it kills the knowledge of good and evil. Yeah.
About guy sitting in the corner of the kitchen of the United States of America. But like, I had a friend who actually said to me recently, the state of democracy right now is like the drama triangle. Those who lose the election feel like victims for the next 4 years. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of the language, that is kind of how it feels. And it's just like, we could get into all kinds of political issues, but I did actually have this thought, because what often comes up is when you have various forms of chaos, people ask the question, what kind of leader would we need? And, I always think of could someone run for office and just begin talking about the quality of discourse rather than issues like, say, hey, look at us, like, let's all look around. I mean, this feels like a fantasy, but yeah, I think what's so beautiful about that story you told, Guy, is it's so simple on some level. It's just like, I mean, but for the most part, especially when like the family dynamic you described, when things have developed to a certain point, it's like the most important thing is always the thing that's not being said. And then, we might have moments where, the mother and a particular child slow down together and they get a little more resonance and something happens. But how often does the whole family unit, or, if it's a workplace, how often does the whole workplace, sort of sense what's really important to everyone here? But if it was literally, like, I was in this conversation, I don't know, maybe a year back, but someone who'd been, had a corporate career, was talking about, I don't forget what year they said, but they just said, there was this revolution that happened when, like, in our meetings, we started having check-ins. She said, workplace was totally different once we started just having check-ins at the beginning of the meeting. Like, just like, we're here to talk about the results of this quarter, but by the way, my kid just left for college, and, like, just for people to know that was like a game changer. Anyway, I'm noticing the time. I know that, Guy, you have somewhere to be, but I want to make a little space for you both for final thoughts. I just loved this. It definitely expanded where Daniel and I were last time, and I feel like there's much more we could do. If you want to come again, you'd be welcome. But
yeah, we'll do it again.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Anything else that either one of you wants to add before we go?
This is great. I hear God's on the other side of that hole.
I would not be surprised if God was right there in that background. It would not surprise me at all. I just wanted to comment very quickly. I love the point that you can't argue it. Like, you can't argue the experience. The more we bring into our discussions things that cannot be argued, means it's not a knowledge of good and evil, it's a history. It's a thing, it's an experience. And so that is anti-dynamic, anti-drama. And the more you bring it in, then I also am giving, I feel like you're relating to me when you respond to that, because you can't argue. And that is what I experience. When you bring in something that can't argue, it actually can increase intimacy because it feels very concrete. So it feels like the world. And now we're pinpointing other world. We're pinpointing that. And what I would also say, Seth, is on that idea of, can you get people running for office with quality of dialogue? Perhaps not. But what I think we are doing with this online space of these recorded conversations is basically a grassroots movement where you're modeling and showing people an alternative way of engaging. And I think the name of the game is not political change, but culture making. And culture making is a faithful presence on a grassroots level based on modeling. And I think that is occurring, and I have a lot of hope in that. And I have a wonderful time speaking with you people. So thank you for your time, and I don't know where the hours go.
Awesome.
Thank you
Look
both.
forward to coming. Bye.
Best to you now.